Do you believe when the New Testament writers quote from the Old Testament and actually write, "It is written," when they're quoting from the Old Testament, misquoted the Old Testament? Me neither. But many people do. You know who? Every single person who doesn't believe that when in the New Testament they quote from the Old Testament originally and write, "It is written," quoting a text that contains the divine name of God. Every single person who believes that when the New Testament does that, whether it's Jesus quoting "It is written" to Satan the devil, or when a writer like Paul quotes, for example, in a text like Romans 14:11 from Isaiah 45:23, "It is written," where the divine name occurs in that text, every single person who believes that in the New Testament, when they quote the Old Testament where it contains the divine name in that quoted text, every person that doesn't believe the New Testament used the divine name from that Old Testament quoted source believes, whether they admit it or not, that the New Testament writers or Jesus or both misquoted the source. Because every single source in the first century and earlier of the Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek Old Testament that is quoted in the New Testament contains a form of the divine name. As I have explained in my videos and in my writings, it's only the later copies of both the Greek Septuagint and the New Testament writings that have a difference. They use what are called nomina sacra, sacred abbreviations, with a line over them, an abbreviation of terms like Lord, God, and other terms, which are not translated that way in our modern English Bibles. But our modern English Bibles, for the most part, perpetuate this idea that the New Testament and Jesus misquoted the Old Testament. That where the Old Testament contains the holy name of God, the most recognizable and holy term in the Old Testament, most modern Bibles and those who don't believe the New Testament originally contained the divine name, where it quoted the Old Testament that contains the divine name, perpetuate the belief that the New Testament and Jesus misquoted the Old Testament. That they wrote, "It is written," and that according to every text available to us, every manuscript, piece of evidence we have from the first century that contains a form of the divine name in the Old Testament, they believe that that was all ignored, and for some unexplained reason, a reason never given by Jesus, never given by Paul, not given in the New Testament at all, they believe that the New Testament, because of later copies after the first century that don't contain the divine name, they believe that in the first century, all the texts in the Old Testament that do contain the divine name were misquoted by Jesus and by the writers of the New Testament. And that's why they don't use the divine name. Because rather than show a consistency between Jesus and the writers of the New Testament, when quoting from all the available Old Testament source material from the first century and earlier, rather than show a consistency that they were quoting from it accurately, not where they're just borrowing language from the Old Testament like we see in Philippians 2, 9 through 11, which takes language from Isaiah 45:23, but uses it in a totally different context where someone's actually given the name above every name, something that would never be said of the God of the Old Testament. No one gives him his name. And where someone is elevated to a position by that God, and all knees are bowed to that God's glory, not to the one who is bowed to for that God's glory, something again that would never be done to the God of the Old Testament in Isaiah, namely that all knees would bow to him to someone else's glory. Texts where language isn't being borrowed in that way and applied in a new sense to the Messiah in relation to that God, but that is quoted. It is written, like in Romans 14:11. Or when Jesus again quotes the Old Testament, it is written to Satan the devil when he was being tempted. When they don't show a consistency between the quotation in the New Testament from the Old Testament, where the divine name occurs, they believe, whether they acknowledge it or not, they are showing by what they're teaching and by what is taught in the translations of our English Bibles and other language Bibles that don't use the divine name, that they believe the New Testament writers and Jesus misquoted texts containing that name for no reason at all. There's not one explanation or any indication that they changed the quotation at all when they say it is written. And yet in Bibles, like the New International Version and many other English language versions, show that what they quote is not as it is written. You know what those who don't believe Jesus and the New Testament writers quoted the Old Testament where it contains the divine name accurately believe, or will not be able to prove to the same extent that those of us who believe the name was used can do? That Jesus is the biblical Messiah. Why? Micah 5. I've talked about this text in my Pre-Christian Evidence that Jesus is the Biblical Messiah series. And I have a blog article in my Watching the Ministry where I talk about the meaning of the text in relation to the origin of the Messiah that I'm going to discuss again as part of my Begotten or Created series. But that tonight I want to discuss in relation to the divine name that proves or doesn't prove that Jesus was the biblical Messiah, and how those who don't believe the divine name was used by Jesus will be unable to prove that Jesus is the Messiah of Micah chapter 5. Let's take a look at it. Let's go to the Bible Hub, where in Micah 5:2 in the New International Version it says, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." Verse 3, New International Version. "Therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor bears a son, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites." Verse 4, the key one, in terms of how if your Bible does not use the divine name, or specifically if you don't believe Jesus used the divine name, I don't think you can prove, and you may not even believe is true, that Jesus is the biblical Messiah. Verse 4, New International Version. "He will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord." All capitals, and we know what that means. It doesn't mean what the divine name means, but it means that's where the divine name should be, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. "And they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth." Talking about the Messiah, whom Christians identify as Jesus. He will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. It doesn't use Lord here in either the Hebrew Aramaic text, in the Masoretic tradition, or in the Greek Septuagint texts that we have evidence from dating to the 1st century or earlier, including the Minor Prophet Scroll, dated to the 1st century. The century in which Jesus lived, the century in which the Christians existed, quoted from the Old Testament in the New Testament to prove that Jesus was the biblical Messiah. You can see a copy of the Minor Prophet Scroll right here that contains the book of Micah. Here you have the Greek text. And in and among the Greek text, what do you see? In Paleo-Hebrew, right here, right next to the letters in Greek, the divine name. Now, the Minor Prophet Scroll has two hands. One hand that wrote part of it, or some books, in the collection of Minor Prophets books, which includes Micah, and a second hand. This is the first hand. Greek text, divine name right here. Here's the second hand. Greek text, divine name right here, and partially right here. Everywhere it should be in the second hand and in the first hand. In the Minor Prophet Scroll, that's where it be. So as I said at the start of this video, and as I have said in many of my videos, and as I have shown in my writings for several decades, all available evidence for the Old Testament in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek shows from the 1st century and earlier that if someone was quoting from the Old Testament, like the New Testament writers or like Jesus, when he's responding to the devil, it is written, would have had a source for the Old Testament containing the divine name, not nomina sacra, not substitute titles like we find in the later copies of the Septuagint, like we find in the later copies of the New Testament. We don't have the original New Testament, but we can show, based on the evidence from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that throughout the 1st century, the divine name was used in and amongst the Greek text, either in Hebrew, Aramaic, or like in 4Q Leviticus B, in Greek letters, Iao. But then later, what was accepted as the inspired Old Testament text, the Greek Septuagint, was changed. The divine name was taken out and replaced by abbreviations of titles like Lord and God with a line over them. The exact same thing that we find in the New Testament that wasn't considered inspired until long after the Greek Septuagint. So, to argue as many do, that the Septuagint could be changed but not the New Testament, when we have evidence to show that during the 1st century the Septuagint wasn't changed in terms of the divine name. We don't have evidence from the 1st century for the New Testament where it quotes the Old Testament using the divine name. So we have later copies of both the Septuagint and the New Testament after the 1st century that show us the same thing. That show us the replacement of the divine name that nobody disputes was in the original Hebrew Aramaic text of the Old Testament, that the Greek Septuagint translated and used the divine name in its text. And those who argue that the original New Testament text, in quoting from the Old Testament where it was containing the divine name and where the quotation was of the form, it is written, not just borrowing language from the text and applying it in a new way, but it is written. They believe that the New Testament writers misquoted the Old Testament text. And in doing so, and in translating their texts from the Old Testament and the New, that replaced the divine name with something new that wasn't in the text, the original Old Testament text, or in the quotation of that text in the New Testament. They believe the quoters misquoted the quoted source. And in doing that, they claim that Jesus came in the name of his God, the Lord. But that's not what the prophecy in Micah said. We know that not just from the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, the Greek text from the first century right here. First hand, second hand, divine name right there and there, but not there. So if the prophecy said that the Messiah would come in the name of Jaho, his God, using the anglicized form of the divine name, but the divine name of his God, and in the translations that we use today, it says something different. Well, which is it? Did he come in the name of the Lord his God based on a translation that's 2,000 years later than when he came? Or did he come in the name of his God? In English, Jaho, Jehovah. That is what they were expecting according to the evidence we have in the Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic text that prophesied about that name, about the name in which the Messiah would come. Those who deny that the New Testament writers quoted the Old Testament accurately where it comes to the name of that God are going to be unable to demonstrate that Jesus came in the name of Jaho, his God. But that's what the prophecy said. That's what the prophecy teaches he would have done. So they're actually contradicting the evidence that Jesus is the biblical Messiah according to the Bible, the actual text of the Bible. Not this later stuff. Not this stuff that was so obviously changed. It's not biblical stuff. Yet they continue to perpetrate the lie. Not only that Jesus came in the name of the Lord, which is a lie, but that the New Testament writers misquoted the Old Testament. It is written. And instead of what was written, use something that was not written, according to all the text evidence that we have from the first century and earlier. It's incredible that we have people like that today calling themselves Christians. Yet they're claiming that the New Testament writers misquoted the Old Testament hundreds of times, that Jesus misquoted the Old Testament several times, and that he came in a name that the text says he would not have come into, namely the Lord his God, when it was Jaho, his God, the name of the Father, his God. Let's just bring up John chapter 5 to show that it's the Father's name. It's not even his name. He says that explicitly right here. Even according to the New International Version, a morally bankrupt translation that absolutely destroys part of the pre-Christian evidence that Jesus is the biblical Messiah by its failed translation of Micah chapter 5. Yet right here in John chapter 5, verse 43, it says, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. But if someone else comes in his own name, you will accept him. In other words, he's not coming in his own name. He says it right here. If someone else comes in his own name, you'll accept him. He didn't do that. He came in whose name? His Father's name. What's the Father's name? Is it Lord? No. It's right here, even in the Greek text. No one disputes that it's in the Hebrew text or Aramaic text of Micah chapter 5. Yet the translations we have today, by and large, except for a couple, mostly old ones, like the American Standard Version, Young's literal translation, they actually use the divine name in Micah chapter 5 and show, consistent with the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek texts of Micah, that the Messiah would come in the name of Jaho, Jehovah his God, not the Lord his God. Further, we have Jesus himself not only showing that he came in his Father's name, not his own name, so that his own name is not the name that the Messiah was prophesied to come into, namely Jaho, Jehovah his God, and whether he was later given that name the same way that the angel of Jaho was given God's name in Exodus 23, 22 through 23, that's a different question. The Father, Jaho, is not given his name by anyone. It's his name. It's his own name, the name in which Jesus came, which is not his own name according to Jesus, John 5:43. Let's take a look at John 8:54. So you can see that Jesus makes it plain it's the Father whom the Jews said was their God. It's the Father's name in which he came, not the Lord, Jaho, Jehovah, the same name that he quoted several times when refuting the devil. The same name that's quoted hundreds of times in the New Testament when the Christians refute the devil by proving Jesus is the biblical Messiah, that he came in the name of Jaho, his God. Micah 5:4 or 3, depending on the Hebrew Greek text, it's a little bit different numbering wise, but in the English version it's 4. He would stand and shepherd in that name. How can you stand and shepherd in someone's name if you're not using the name? Obviously, Jesus not only used the name when he quoted texts that used the name, but he stood and shepherded in that name in fulfillment of Micah 5 because he's the biblical Messiah. Not some false Messiah who uses a false name that's not a part of that prophecy, namely Lord. Like these false, bankrupt translations use that maintain an inconsistency with the Old Testament views and teachings about the Messiah. Jesus again says, John 8:54, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. If he's God, Trinitarians, how could that be? That would mean everything if he glorified himself. Jehovah says over and over, I will glorify myself. He says right here, the Son of God, if he does that, it means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God. Trinitarians, who was the Jews' God? Who did the Jews claim was their God according to Jesus, Trinitarians? The Father. The one in whose name Jesus came. John 5:43. The one whom Micah 5 prophesied the Messiah would come in, whose name he would come in, but whose name is different in your translations of the Bible, and whose name barely, even if at all, appears in your Bible. It's disgusting. Right here, Jesus makes clear it's the Father who was the one the Jews claim as their God. In John 5:43 again, he makes it clear it's the Father's name in which he came, consistent with Micah chapter 5, which teaches the Messiah would come in the name of Jaho, in the English form of the name that I use, or Jehovah, or Yahweh. But we don't speak Hebrew, and we don't use entirely Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek forms of the name. And the Bible doesn't say we have to use one specific form of the name. But you know what it does say? The Messiah would come in that name. It does not say, like the New International Version claims, that he would come and stand and shepherd in the name of the Lord. That's definitely not what it says. And it also is clear that in the New Testament, if you don't use the divine name, where the New Testament writers or Jesus quotes from the Old Testament that uses that name, you believe that Jesus and the New Testament writers misquoted the Old Testament And you likely will have a much more difficult time proving Jesus is the biblical Messiah, because in your translation of Micah 5, the Messiah doesn't come in the name that he was prophesied to come in. He comes in a different name, a name that you gave to his God that is not the name of his God.